All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our public information meeting. This is on U.S. Ecology Detroit South. It's also known as EQ Detroit. It's on their hazardous waste license renewal and application. So glad we could see several of you join us. We got about 39 people logged in so far, and I'm sure we're going to have several more continue to log in. But it is 6 o'clock, and that's the start time of our meeting. So my name is Jim Ostrowski, and I work in the Environmental Support Division here at Eagle, and I'll be one of the moderators for tonight. Just a few housekeeping guidelines to go through. First of all lines are muted. It means that you can hear us, but we can't hear you. When we get to the Q&A part of the evening, I'll explain how to unmute your mics. You can ask your questions if you like. You can ask questions by typing them into the Q&A box on your Zoom toolbar. So if you look at your Zoom toolbar, you have a little Q&A button there. You can type it in there and it'll come into us. If you'd like to ask your question verbally, you can click the raise hand icon. And when you do that, we will call on your name when we get the Q&A, and we'll unmute your mic at that time. So you'll see something pop up that'll allow you to unmute. You probably noticed we are recording this meeting, and we'll post it on our YouTube channel as soon as we can. So probably tomorrow or on Monday, we'll have it up there available for you to view or pass along to others that might want to see it. So that's all I have for housekeeping. I'm going to turn it over to Tracy Cascametti. So Tracy, are you there? And Andrew, you can share your slides now.
Good. Thanks, Jim. I appreciate that. Well, good evening, everyone. Like Jim said, my name is Tracy Cascametti. I am the district supervisor in our Warren district office, which covers the Metro Detroit area, for the Materials Management Division, which is the group in Eagle, or the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. We'll call it Eagle. We're the group that handles and oversees regulatory affairs for hazardous waste facilities, places that manage hazardous waste, but also places that generate that kind of waste. We also oversee the solid waste landfills and the state's recycling programs. And in the Warren District office, we're the local branch of the Eagle department that we house the inspectors that would go out and inspect these facilities. So we're sort of your local boots on the ground folks. But we do have a lot of people on the line tonight that are going to present information to you, but also be available for questions. And so our main presenter is Andrew Bertapelli, who's also with the Materials Management Division. He's an environmental engineer. He's the guy that is doing all, the majority of the technical review along with his team to draft this license and to do that review. He is typically in our Lansing office. All the staff that are on this call tonight, we're all coming to you from our homes, even though we're normally stationed in either Lansing or Warren. So Andrew, Andrew's on the screen up there. If you want to say hello, give a wave. That's Andrew.
Hello, everyone.
All right, thanks, Andrew. Next, we have Al Taylor, who is the section manager for our hazardous waste program. He is also a Lansing headquarters guy, but he heads up our hazardous waste program. Al Taylor, do you want to turn on your camera and say hi?
Yeah, good evening. Thanks for joining us tonight.
And then Rich Conforti, who is another manager in our hazardous waste program. Al, Rich, and Andrew all work together on the same team in our hazardous waste program to review these sorts of facilities. Rich, where are you tonight? There's Rich.
Good evening.
All right. We also have with us Nicole Sanabria, who is a geologist in our hazardous waste program, also in Lansing. So Nicole is, in charge of looking at any of the groundwater monitoring data or any sort of hydrogeological information for the site. Nicole, are you on? Do you want to say hello?
Hi, everyone.
She is. And lastly, one of our newest team members, Ricardo Jaimes. He's an environmental quality analyst in our hazardous waste section. He's on the line.
Hello, everyone.
All right. And then bringing it back a little more locally, like I said, in our Warren District office, we are your local branch office. We house the inspectors. So Jim Day works with me on my team in the hazardous waste program. He is the main inspector for a hazardous waste program that goes out to U.S. Ecology and does the compliance evaluations. think that Jim was having some technical problems earlier. I don't know if he can get his camera on, but Jim, if you want to say hello.
Yeah, no, I can't get my video, but hello and glad to be here.
Thanks, Jim. And finally, we have John Lamb with us, who is with our air quality division. He's an inspector out of our Detroit district office. Many of you may be familiar with him. And John responds to an awful lot of complaints out of our Detroit district office. He inspects facilities that are subject to air quality regulations, and he is the assigned inspector for US Ecology Detroit South. And appreciate you being here, John. Do you want to say hi?
Hello.
So that's our panel. And as Jim Ostrowski mentioned in the beginning, all those folks are available here tonight to answer any questions you may have. Andrew's going to go through the agenda and bring, the majority of the content, the upfront presentation. And then everyone here on the line can be available for the question and answer session later. So I'm going to turn this back over to Andrew. And I really appreciate everyone making the time to join us tonight. So thank you.
All right, well, thanks, Tracy. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us. As Tracy mentioned, my name is Andrew Bertapelli, and I'm the engineer on Eagle's project team assigned to the licensing of hazardous waste operations at US Ecology Detroit South. I'm calling that also EQ Detroit. Some of you may know it that way. So tonight we're doing an informational meeting to learn about Eagle's licensing process and the renewal application submitted by US Ecology. And after the words, we'll open up the floor for any questions. All right, so before we get into the details of Eagle's licensing process, I want to touch a little bit on background for hazardous waste operating licenses. So first of all, exactly what are these licenses and when are they required? So these licenses are needed for anyone who wants to treat, store, or dispose of hazardous waste. It's not just for people who generate hazardous waste or transport it. We tend to call them TSDs for treat, store, or dispose, but I'll try and stay away from the acronyms here tonight. The licenses themselves are detailed documents that describe specifically what a company has to do to safely and properly manage hazardous wastes. And the goal of these, the purpose of these licenses, is to protect human health and the environment from any potential hazards associated with the management of hazardous wastes. And so this goal, protecting human health and the environment, helps to guide the development of any license conditions and final licensing decisions. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Eagle's licensing process here. So if you're treating, storing, or disposing of hazardous waste, first you submit an application to Eagle. That application has to include a variety of detailed information about the site operations and how the company proposes to comply with all the hazardous waste laws at their site. Once Eagle receives that application, we conduct two different reviews, what we call a completeness review, and then again, a technical review. Review is used to confirm that all the various requirements needed for the application have in fact been included. The technical review you can think of as more of a quality check to see if the information is compliant and if the proposed operations can be conducted safely. So something Eagle's doing to try and enhance our public involvement process in this licensing, we're holding additional informational meetings more than we used to do. So after we complete each one of those reviews, so after we complete the completeness review, Eagle holds a meeting like this one tonight to let the public know about what's going on at the site and about the application and to answer any questions that you might have. And then again, once we finish the technical review stage, we'd be holding another meeting and we'd maybe dig into a little more of the details about the specific proposed operations. So based on the outcome of all those reviews, Eagle may make a tentative proposal to either deny the application, to approve the application, and issue a license, or alternately to propose modifications to the application. It's important to note that before any final decisions are made on these applications, either to approve or deny, Eagle first goes through a formal public input process involving a public comment period and a public hearing. And any comments we receive during those times, we'd review and respond to those comments in writing. All right, so where are we in this process for this facility? US Ecology Detroit South submitted a renewal application on September 10th, 2008, which allowed them to continue operating until Eagle makes a final decision on the application. Eagle determined the application was administratively complete on September of 2012. And review work on this application moved pretty slowly for a while due to staffing shortages and backlogs of review work. More recently though, Eagle has been able to complete an initial technical review and sent comments to the facility in September of 2017. US Ecology then responded with additional information and multiple revisions to the original application. And most recently, US Ecology submitted a rewritten waste analysis plan, which is a component of licenses which involve various waste characterization requirements. All right, so a little bit of background on the site. So first of all, where are we located here? US Ecology Detroit South is located at 1923 Frederick Street. And it's about a half mile or so southeast of the intersection of I-75 and I-94. The actual property is zoned for heavy industrial use, and the surrounding area is kind of a mixture of residential, commercial, and industrial. A little bit of history on the site. Throughout the 1900s, it's been used for a variety of different applications. For example, wire manufacturing or rendering operations. In the 1980s, waste management activities first began at the site. The first hazardous waste license was in 1990, which is pretty early on in the scope of hazardous waste licensing. And then another license was issued in 2003. So at that time, the facility was actually owned by a company called US Liquids. In 2004, a company called the Environmental Quality Company, or EQ, purchased the facility from US Liquids. And then in 2014, US Ecology acquired EQ. So that's kind of where you get the different names for the facility, US Ecology Detroit South or EQ Detroit. All right, so I'm going to talk a bit about the kind of high level of the site operations that US Ecology is proposing to renew these operations. US Ecology stores and treats a variety of wastes, including both hazardous waste and non-hazardous waste. Although tonight's meeting, we're focused specifically on the hazardous waste operations. But that begs the question, what exactly is a hazardous waste? And we kind of use specific jargon to mean certain things in our field. So hazardous waste is different from your household trash you might send to the local dump. That would probably be considered non-hazardous solid waste. In contrast, hazardous wastes are often created as byproducts from a variety of industrial manufacturing and commercial processes. So these wastes are considered hazardous. They may exhibit certain characteristics, that might be ignitable or flammable wastes, or wastes that are especially reactive, maybe corrosive wastes like acids and bases, or toxic wastes, which may depend on the specific toxicity of the chemicals they contain. So because of these hazardous characteristics in these wastes, special care is needed when handling them, and sites that manage these wastes are highly regulated. Any incompatible wastes, meaning they could react with each other if they were mixed, they're required, regardless of where they are on the site, to be stored separately from one another. So specifically at this site, US Ecology stores wastes in dedicated tanks, or we call it container storage areas. And they also treat wastes in different types of tanks, depending on the specific process they're using. And I'll touch a little bit on some of the details of those specific treatment operations as we go through the different areas of the site. One thing I do want to note, though, is that it's important that the facility does not dispose of any waste on site. So we talked before about the TSD, treatment, storage, disposal. So this facility is just that TS portion, treatment and storage. So any waste that they treat will be shipped off site for final disposal at, for example, in a permitted hazardous waste or non-hazardous waste landfill. All right, so we got an image here kind of showing some of the different areas of the site. There's two main buildings we're going to be talking about where the actual treatment operations occur. So that is the number one here, the main treatment building, or the wastewater treatment building, and number two, the chemical fixation building.
Hey, Andrew, sorry to interrupt, but just want to let you know, we do have several people on the phone who might not be able to see your diagram. So you might just want to do your best to try to explain where the buildings are for those that are just on the phone.
For how much this helps, the main treatment building is kind of on the southwest of the site. They're kind of the two biggest buildings on site. The chemical fixation building is on the northwest corner, kind of by Ferry Street there. And there's a variety of other areas where they're not treating, but they are licensed to store hazardous waste in specific ways. I'll step through each of these different areas. All right, so again, first we're talking about the main treatment building, or that wastewater treatment building. And again, that's towards the south of the site. This building's licensed for the treatment and storage of hazardous wastes in above ground tanks made of steel, fiberglass, or polyethylene. There's also dedicated areas of the building where waste may be stored in containers. The main treatment building is largely for the treatment of hazardous wastewaters, including waste containing heavy metals or acids or waste sludges. Some of the treatment processes, the use of chemicals to basically have solid particulate matter and those metals settle out of the wastewaters. They do some neutralization of acidic or corrosive wastes, and they also use some filter presses to try and separate out the solids and liquids in sludge wastes, and then those solids and liquids are treated separately. Any of the wastes that are corrosive wastes are specifically stored and treated in dedicated portions of the facility. And hazardous waste tanks are equipped with a variety of safety features, and those might include high-level overflow alarms. Additional to the waste stored in the building also contains tanks with the raw materials used in the treatment processes. And US Ecology also has an on-site dedicated laboratory, which is located along the south side of the main treatment building. All right, so a concept I'm going to be touching on a lot tonight. It's pretty critical to our hazardous waste licensing. It's one of the main safety features that we have at these sites. It's called secondary containment. So you can think of the actual drum or container or tank where the waste is being actually stored or treated as the primary containment. And then outside of that, we have secondary containment, and I'll kind of describe what those kind of look like at the site as we go through here. So secondary containment in this building includes treated concrete floors, which are sloped and curbed to dedicated collection floor drains and trenches. And the whole purpose here is to make sure that even if a container or a tank were to leak or spill, none of that waste would get into the environment in the soils or groundwater. So in this wastewater treatment building, wastewaters are treated on site down to levels that are defined in a permit that US Ecology has with the Great Lakes Water Authority. Used to be the Detroit Water and Sewerage Department. So Great Lakes Water Authority, also called GLEWA. And once they treat it down to those levels, they're allowed to discharge treated wastes into the sewer system for further treatment at the public wastewater treatment plant that GLEWA operates. And we'll touch a little bit more on this later on when we talk about monitoring programs at the site. All right, so the next building I mentioned was the chemical fixation building up toward the northwest corner of the site. This building again is used for the treatment of a variety of both hazardous and non-hazardous wastes using treatment techniques, including stabilization. Other pre-treatment methods may also be used to neutralize or deactivate certain hazardous characteristics before the stabilization occurs. Okay, but when I say stabilization, what does that mean exactly? Essentially, it's a way to reduce the ability of the waste to leak into water, and it allows the waste to be safely disposed of in licensed landfills. The way they do that is by mixing the waste with certain stabilizing agents, which react kind of similarly to cement. So that, concrete cement operation is kind of a good way to visualize what's going on here. Treatment in this building is performed within, it's a little bit different than the main treatment building. It's within licensed in-ground rectangular steel vaults, which are surrounded by a concrete containment structure. And that structure acts as secondary containment for those. Reagents and wastes, some of them may actually be stored in external silos, and there's a device they use to either directly put waste into those treatment vaults, or there's a device to transfer from those silos. Important component in the chemical fixation building are the emission controls. So the entire building is actually under what we call negative pressure. Basically, it's under a vacuum, and all the air from outside gets sucked up into the building rather than the other way around. And all that air goes through their air handling system and through filters before it actually is discharged to the atmosphere. Similarly, there's also areas in this building which are licensed for the storage of waste in containers. And again, incompatible waste are stored in separate areas, and secondary containment is used. So here's just kind of a picture of kind of what the inside of that building looks like. And you can see these rectangular shapes here. Those are those in-ground treatment vaults. All right, so those are the main two buildings where the actual treatment's occurring. We'll step through a little bit of what the other, just storage areas are though. So first we have the aptly named container storage and staging areas. And that's number 3 here, kind of more or less the middle of the site. So these are used for the storage and staging of hazardous wastes, a lot of times to be treated in the chemical fixation building. And these are completely enclosed within their own buildings, which are attached to the chemical fixation building. Secondary containment here includes epoxy-coated concrete floors, which are curved and sloped towards isolated collection sumps. And then we have the north container drum pad. This is on the north end of the chemical fixation building, so right next to near Ferry Street there, the top, number 4. And the storage and the secondary containment for this is very similar. Next, we have the lab pack or DPAC area. This is right at the top, the north end of the site there, number 5. This is used for specific types of hazardous waste containers called lab packs. You can think about these as small containers of compatible waste, which are placed together within a larger overpack container. Again, it's completely enclosed and it's designed with secondary containment. All right, a little bit different. We have the rail area. This is towards the southwest portion of the site here. It's blue area, number 6. And as you might guess, this is used to receive and store shipments of hazardous waste by rail car. The secondary containment here is a little bit different. It was created by excavating soils and replacing with a PVC liner and covering with a stone backfill. And that provides a collection system, even in the case of any sort of potential spills, again, preventing any sort of releases to the environment. A couple other waste management areas I wanted to touch on. Now, these aren't necessarily covered under this licensing action, but just kind of give you an idea of what else is going on at the site. So first we have the process building and used oil tanks. That's right smack dab in the middle of the facility there, number 7, that green area. So this area is used for the management of non-hazardous waste, such as used oil. This is regulated by EGLE, but separately under Michigan's liquid industrial byproducts rules. And then finally, we've got the transfer and processing area at the top of the site there, number 8. This is used for the short-term storage of hazardous wastes, and it's again regulated by EGLE separately as a transfer site under the hazardous waste transportation rules. The only other area I've got listed here is the building right at the southeast of the site. That's the administration building, so it's office space. All right, so went through high level on some of the main areas of the site that are involved. And the purpose of the a license is to ensure that these site operations can be and are in fact performed in such a way that will prevent any impacts to human health or the environment. Besides the actual site operations, engineered safety features, and extensive waste characterization requirements, which are required throughout the handling of waste on site, the license also specifies specific preparedness and prevention and contingency plan procedures. So US Ecology is required to notify EGLE for any noncompliance, big or small, and more serious noncompliance events would require immediate notification and would potentially result in penalties. US Ecology also maintains agreements with local emergency response authorities like the fire and police departments, and goal there is to basically make sure that those local authorities know what kind of waste operations are going on. The facility has defined emergency contacts and coordinators. That's both for on-site personnel as well as go-tos at the local and state authorities. And there's also a variety of emergency equipment like fire suppression systems, on-site communication alarm systems, spill control equipment, and decontamination equipment. All that equipment is inspected on a regular basis. And we'll talk a little bit about inspections at the site. So for the hazardous waste operations at US Ecology, EGLE staff inspect the facility for hazardous waste operations at least 4 times a year. And this is not including any inspections EGLE may perform for other programs. So the non-hazardous waste operations or air quality inspections, that sort of thing. US Ecology is also required to perform extensive self-inspections at the site, and the actual frequencies and requirements for those inspections are specified in the license. And those are a variety of daily, weekly, and monthly inspections, depending on what exactly is being inspected. All right, and talk a little bit about environmental monitoring at the site. So the first program here is the ambient air monitoring program. At US Ecology Detroit South, they have 3 different ambient air monitoring stations. And they're required to monitor on a regular basis for various contaminants, such as certain metals, organic matter, or particulates. The site submits monthly reports with these results to EGLE, and they're reviewed by both the Air Quality Division and Materials Management Division. And I have a side note here too. US Ecology also has a separate air permit issued by our Air Quality Division. That's different from this, but that is also another way that we limit air emissions at the site. All right, so here you can kind of see where those ambient air monitoring stations are, kind of encircling the areas where hazardous wastes are managed. All right, next up is the groundwater and soil monitoring. And US Ecology was previously granted waivers from routine groundwater and soil monitoring waivers. Conditions for waivers are detailed in the hazardous waste rules. The waiver for routine groundwater monitoring was issued based on the site geology and hydrogeological conditions. And the routine soil monitoring waiver was because all licensed areas where hazardous wastes are managed are actually in those paved and secondary containment areas. So as part of the licensing renewal process, EGLE's re-examining these waivers along with the need for any other potential monitoring requirements at the site. And last up for the environmental monitoring, we have the wastewater discharge monitoring. GLEWA, the Great Lakes Water Authority, is kind of the primary lead on this. Like I mentioned before, US Ecology has a different permit with GLEWA, specifically setting conditions for their wastewater discharge. And the site is required to perform routine sampling and analysis of the treated wastewater effluent that's discharged to the sewers. And GLEWA also samples and analyzes their own on their own to audit those. As part of the effort for greater transparency, EGLE has actually developed a scorecard of sorts showing the site's recent monitoring compliance history, and that's available on our webpage for the site. All right, so that's a lot of information about the facility. I went through some of their overview of their site operations and different requirements. So at this point, like I mentioned before, we'll continue working on the technical review, including with the revised waste analysis plan. And as I mentioned before, this involves a close look at the application, evaluating against the rules and technical guidance, involves consultations with EPA, other EGLE staff, and field verifications. After EGLE completes the technical review, we'll invite you to another one of these meetings to discuss our findings. And as a side note, emphasizing here, during this whole review process, EGLE is still continuously overseeing the facility operations. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to Tracy here to talk about a little more details.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So, Andrew spent a good amount of time talking about how this license, how a hazardous waste license is developed, right? And so the facility is operating under a current license, and they've applied for a renewal. And they're, our hazardous waste program staff are reviewing that application, and that review is ongoing. But the hazardous waste license really sets up a framework for how we regulate this facility. And even though the license application is under review, they're subject to the conditions of the existing license. And so I sort of think of licensing as one aspect, but we continue to assess compliance all of the time. And so there's a number of ways that we do that. I think the most common one that you might think of is by doing inspections. So, you met Jim Day at the beginning of the meeting. He's one of our inspectors out of the Warren District Office. He will inspect this facility at least 4 times a year to evaluate compliance with the hazardous waste license. Because the facility also holds a solid waste license, we have other inspectors that go out there also 4 separate times during the year to evaluate compliance with their solid waste license. That doesn't include inspections that may take place from our Air Quality Division or from the Great Lakes Water Authority. So, I think we all think of inspections as a way to assess compliance, but we have other ways as well. So Andrew talked about the environmental monitoring that is required by this facility, the air monitoring. And so that data is submitted, and we have professional staff that review that data and compare it with the relevant criteria and determine if anything's exceeding criteria there. The facility has, regular submittals that are required, operating reports and that sort of thing that our staff review and evaluate for compliance. And then we also respond to complaints. And so you met John Lamb at the beginning of the time we have, and he responds to any odor complaints that we might get. Our staff would, respond to complaints of, spills or, any other sort of unusual conditions that people observe. So there's a lot of different ways that we assess compliance. And if you should ever observe something that you think is unusual or, not quite right, maybe it's, some sort of discolored, air emission, or it's something, running out down the driveway, or some dust or some odor or something, the kinds of things that we might get reports of at, different kinds of industrial facilities. We do have a 24-hour hotline. It's called the Pollution Emergency Alerting System Hotline. That number's at the bottom of the screen. So for the folks that are on the phone, that number is 1-800-292-4706. Again, it's a 24-hour, that's a pollution reporting system. So, that's not necessarily who to call if you just have a question, or, if you're looking for more information on something. But again, if you have some sort of complaint or report of an environmental release or, a nuisance odor, something like that, you can use that hotline. Go ahead, Andrew. So we have a database. It's called the Waste Data System. There's a forward-facing component to this on our website. So if you go to www.eagle.state.mi.us and then /WDSPI, I apologize for that long link there, but for the folks on the phone, and I can repeat that later if anyone needs, but here's where you can find a summary of the work that we do. And so there's a search bar at the top. If you type in US Ecology, you can, click on, the address will show up, and you can click on the US Ecology facility that you're interested in. You can also put in EQ Detroit. I believe that still works. But here's where you can see when we conducted our inspections and what the results of those inspections are, when we've reviewed monitoring data and that sort of thing. So this is a place that you can look for more information. And then in the event that violations are identified, either through our inspections or through, our review of required submittals, or because the facility has self-reported them, which, they have obligations under their license to self-report certain kinds of incidents, we have a progressive strategy for addressing those violations. And I think a lot of you are familiar with this. I look at the list of participants here. I see a lot of familiar names, folks that are really engaged in, in environmental issues in the community. So I think you've heard some of this before, but, I think of this as finding the right tool for the job, right? So our goal in our enforcement policy is to get corrective action, to get the violation corrected swiftly, right? And so we have a range of tools for that, from informal to formal actions. So things that are considered informal would be like a violation notice, which is a letter that we write that, cites the violation, cites the requirement that was deviated from, and it, requires the facility to correct that. A violation notice doesn't come with a penalty, but it's our sort of our first line tool to identify a problem and ask for it to be corrected. We use that typically with minor violations and things that are quickly corrected. So if there's, if we do an inspection and there's some training records missing, or if there's a small discrepancy in some labeling of containers or something like that, that's when you might see a violation notice issued. Depending on the nature of the violation, and this is true at any facility that Eagle regulates, we have the same enforcement strategy across the department. So depending on the nature of the violation, if it's something more significant, or if correcting that violation is going to require a long-term schedule, we may enter into a more formal enforcement process. The most typical tool we have in that category for our more significant violations is an administrative consent order. So this is a legally enforceable document, but it's something that is negotiated and agreed upon with the facility, that both Eagle and the facility sign, and it contains, the plan that the facility is going to follow to correct the violation, the schedule that they're going to do that on, and we can assess penalties in administrative consent order. We can assess penalties up front, to sort of recoup a penalty for the violations that have occurred. And we can sort of attach penalties what we call stipulated penalties if the sorts of violations that are dealt with in this order continue. So, we can, this consent order will stay active for some period of time, and if the violations recur in the future, we can make a demand for penalties this way. One thing that I hear a lot about our administrative consent order process is that folks think the penalties are too low, that the statute allows for $25,000 a day. Why are we only, assessing a penalty of $2,500 a day? And the thing I like to talk about when we think about administrative consent orders is that, our focus is on getting the violation corrected. If we would like to assess the maximum penalty provided for by statute, we're going to have to do that by suing a company. And when you sue a company and you take the resources of the Attorney General's office to do that, we end up in court for many, many years. And during that time, we're not getting resolution of the violation. And we may not even get resolution of the violation the way we would like it, at the end of that time period. So the consent order is like I said, it's a negotiated tool, but it's a way to get at the thing that needs to be fixed now, while also having that economic incentive or disincentive, right, for the company to discontinue that violation. So that is the formal enforcement tool you will see most frequently used by the department. In the event that a company won't accept a consent order, or in the event that the consent order is not complied with, that's where we may move into a litigation kind of situation. And this slide really just is intended to highlight some recent compliance actions that Materials Management Division has conducted related to US Ecology Detroit South. So in September of 2020, we entered into an administrative consent order with US Ecology. This was not under our hazardous waste license, but was under our solid waste license. And this consent order is intended to address the nuisance odors that have been documented in the surrounding community. So it requires an odor management plan, which was actually just received today. The order was entered in September, and it gave the facility 90 days to come up with this plan. And it also attaches, those stipulated penalties I talked about for future violations. So what I expect out of this odor management plan, and admittedly, I received it right before this meeting, but the order requires that this plan identify short and long-term solutions for this odor problem. So things that they can do right away if an odor is occurring, and then things they can do to prevent odors or manage them on a more long-term. So we will know much more about that plan, and I'm happy to answer more questions about that when we get into the Q&A. But as I looked back over the last few years, just to see what sorts of compliance actions we'd had out there, it was this consent order. And then in May of 2019, we issued 2 violation notices on 2 separate issues. One was, what I think of as more administrative. The license requires this environmental monitoring data to be submitted to both Air Quality Division and to the Materials Management Division. We're a large organization, and we have lots of different technical staff reviewing things. And we found that data was being submitted to the Air Quality Division, but not to us. So like I said, that's an administrative violation. We issued this violation notice. It was very quickly resolved. The other violation notice that we issued in May of 2019 was for a sort of yellow discolored air emission that resulted from their treatment process. And that was, that was handled under a violation notice, which is again, that sort of informal strategy. And they changed some of their standard operating procedures and improved some of their post-treatment testing, and resolved that issue to our satisfaction. So that violation is considered closed. What's next, Andrew? So moving forward, like Andrew said, this license process is going to be a long one, and we will come back to you again with a meeting like this when we've completed our technical review of the license and we have the results of that review to share. There's a couple things you can do to stay connected with us in the meantime. You can subscribe to the mailing list that we maintain for anyone who's interested in this facility. So go to michigan.gov/EGLE Connect, and you can subscribe online to that mailing list. And generally, I'm going to offer up Andrew as a contact person or a contact point for any question you may have on this facility, and he will get you to the right person. If your question ends up being about air quality issues, he'll get you over to the air folks. If it's about inspections and compliance and enforcement, he'll get you over to our group. But for the folks on the phone, I'm going to read this out. Again, his name's Andrew Bertapelli. His email address is BERTAPELLEA1, so Bertapelli A1 at michigan.gov, or you can call him at 517-290-3813. And then, if you're finding that you want more information based on what we've brought to you tonight, we've built a website for this facility. It's michigan.gov/US Ecology Detroit South. On that website, you can find the application. You can find an action summary that describes what it is we're doing with this application. You can find the environmental scorecard that summarizes the facility's compliance status with their license and with their discharge permit and their air monitoring. So there's a lot of useful information there. And we've also translated some of those documents, including the action summary, into Bengali and Arabic to make that more accessible for the community around this facility. Typically, I would say, if you want to review any of this information in person, you can come into our office. Right now, our offices are closed. But should you need paper copies of this information, please get with Andrew and work with him. We'll get one of our secretaries to work with you to get that information to you in whatever format you need it. And then lastly, I just want to point out, should you want to learn more about US Ecology as a company, they have some resources that they can share with you. This is usecology.com, and when you go to this website, there's a feature. You click on locations, you enter in Detroit, everything in the Detroit area pops up. You can read about the different kinds of facilities that they have. There's a small video they've put together that explains what their operations are at US Ecology. And so, should you want to find more information about them as a company, that information is available as well. So now I'm going to turn this back over to Jim Ostrowski. He has some poll questions for the group.
All right, thanks, Tracy. While we're getting set up here for questions and Q&A, we do have some poll questions. We don't usually ask poll questions during public meetings, but we thought we'd try it out at this meeting. So I'm just gonna put a couple poll questions up, and for those of you that are logged in, you should be able to do your best to try to answer them. You don't have to answer them, but if you want, that helps us out to get an idea of, how we're doing and where you're getting information from. If you haven't already, if you open up the chat button on your toolbar, Christine has put in a lot of helpful links and information that you might want to use as Andrew was going through his presentation. A lot of them popped up and when Tracy was talking. So take a minute and check those out. All right, I'm going to end this poll. Thank you all for participating. I appreciate that. Here's another one really quick. I'm going to launch. And this is just asking, did you or were you sign up to receive electronic updates on licensing and operations? So Christine in the chat, she mentioned how you can get automatically notified via email on any updates that are going on. So you might want to consider that to keep you updated. And I want to remind you that if you have a question, you can type it into the question box, and we'll be getting to questions in just a moment. So hang in there with me. And one more question. This is asking about the translated documents. So Tracy mentioned earlier that we have translated some of the documents, I think into Arabic and Bengali, posted them online to our website. We just want to know if you're using them, or if you have used them, if you find them helpful, that helps us know. So if you wouldn't mind answering that question, also, we'd appreciate it. Again, these types of things help us out at Eagle. We're now in a virtual world, and so we're trying our best to provide this information virtually to you all, as we can't be there. All right. Looks like most of you who are going to vote have voted, so thank you. And appreciate you all doing that. Andrew, I'm going to bring the presentation back to me. So right, got to put up on our the resources page. I'll put it back there. So if people want to copy that information down, they can. All right, well, let's get to some questions and answers. If some of my panelists want to pop up, you can. And we'll start going through these. I'd want to remind you, if you have a question, you can type it into the question box that's on your GoToWebinar toolbar. You can also click the raise hand icon, and we will try to unmute your line so you can ask your question verbally. All right, so got a lot of questions that have come in so far. First question, this person's asking, why would the community want a hazardous waste site in their neighborhood? We just got rid of an incinerator that caused many people in the community to have cancer. Public neighborhoods should not be a site considered for this type of project. With all due respect, this is not something that adds on to our community. So Tracy, you want to address that?
Yeah, sure, Jim. I can try. You know, and we get this question a lot, and I understand this. You know, I think you hear the words hazardous waste. I can appreciate that there's sort of a natural anxiety that may come from that. And so, you know, I have variations of this conversation with folks all the time. You know, Andrew mentioned at the beginning, you know, this facility has been there for a long, long time. So this is not the siting of a new facility. This, you know, facility has been there in one way or another for decades. And, you know, I recognize that there were a lot of different public policies and a lot of historic decision making that went into why facilities were located where they are and how neighborhoods evolved and changed around them, and what sorts of folks live in those neighborhoods now versus, you know, what that neighborhood looked like 40 years ago. I think that's a really complicated situation we find ourselves in, and something we're trying very hard to address. So I'm not sure if we've got them on the line with us tonight, but some of you may be familiar with the fact that under this administration, the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy has a position called the Office of Environmental Justice Public Advocate. And that office is held by Regina Strong, and she has an environmental justice coordinator that works with her. Her name is Katie Cruz. And these women are working on our environmental justice policies and trying to see where these opportunities are to try to address some of these historic injustices. So, you know, we can't change the siting of this facility, not through this licensing action or otherwise at this point. But I think what we can do is improve these collaborations, right? And really improve our engagement with the community so that folks understand what is located there. They understand how they can get information about it. And they understand our process, you know, for trying to develop a framework and for ensuring that these facilities operate as safely as they can. You know, what I would tell people is that, you know, living near this facility, you know, you should be as safe living in that community as I am, you know, living where I live. So I certainly understand this sentiment, and you know, I think the siting is a challenge. You know, there's a lot of history and a lot of historic decisions that went into how these things came to be co-located. And what we're working on doing now is developing, you know, the framework and the regulations that are as protective as public health and the environment as we can.
Thanks, Tracy. And I will introduce Regina Strong. So Regina's here. I don't know if you want to say anything, Regina. I don't know if you got introduced at the beginning.
Oh, no, Tracy, you did a great job of answering that, because I think you're spot on in saying that we can't change the location now, but we are working to move forward with being as protective as we can, to make it as safe as we can for people who live in communities near sites that are historically sited, unfortunately, you know, based on a host of like past practices that put them smack in the middle of oftentimes, you know, Black and brown communities, oftentimes lower income communities, oftentimes really close to where people live. And so, you know, the question is valid. Like you said, Tracy, it is a difficult one for us. And so we want to be as protective as we can of communities. So that's all I would add to what Tracy said.
All right, thanks, Regina. Let's get some more questions here. Got a lot of them coming in. What precautions will specifically be taken if a spill happens to ensure air quality isn't worse than it currently is?
Yeah, I can try to address that, Jim. So one thing to keep in mind, well, first, let me back up. The facility has a contingency plan, right? This is required under the license, and they are required to evaluate, potentials for release and have in place, what they will do to respond to that. A hazardous waste treatment, storage, and disposal facility, these folks are in the business of environmental cleanup, environmental management. And so, I'll say they're well versed in this sort of activity, right? But a contingency plan is intended so that there's a plan, there's a procedure already in place that when an event happens, you don't have to figure out what to do, right? You have the plan and you've exercised the plan. So the plan requires that, or the license requires that the facility have this plan and that they coordinate with local emergency responders so that local emergency response organizations understand what kinds of materials are stored and used at the facility and that they're prepared for those. And I know that US Ecology has done these exercises with Detroit Fire in the past to practice for these sorts of events. Certainly if you're thinking about, how would a spill impact air quality, you have to think about, what kind of chemical is being spilled and where. And so, I can't really maybe speculate on every potential release example. Like I think Andrew mentioned that there is some ambient monitoring at the perimeter of the facility, so that could give us an idea if there was a specific release, if that had impact on air quality. Andrew also mentioned the secondary containment that's at the facility. So for everything that they're storing, they have to be able to provide containment so that can't run into the sewers. And so, I guess I would just point to this contingency plan as the framework that we have for being prepared for emergencies.
All right, thanks, Tracy. This next one is, I think, referring to something that I was brought up by Andrew earlier. It said, they're asking, it was said that trash will be stored off-site elsewhere, specifically where? Will it be in the city or near the city? And I'm wondering if they mean trash by hazardous waste, because Andrew, you were talking about them just treating it and not storing it or not disposing it on site. So who wants to address that question?
Andrew, I'll let you talk. I've been doing a lot of talking.
All right. So I think what they're referring to is when I was specifying that the facility doesn't perform any disposal operations. So like I said, these licenses are required for the treatment, storage, or disposal of hazardous waste. And at this facility, US Ecology does those treatment and storage components. Disposal is more like, landfilling or surface impoundments, that sort of thing. So the facility takes waste from generators or different facilities, treats them on site through some of the processes that we described. And then once they've treated them down to certain levels, then they are sent off-site to, depending on the chemical, and it gets a little bit into the weeds there, but off-site to disposal facilities, depending on the levels of contaminants, they could be sent to a licensed hazardous waste landfill, or if they're treated down to certain levels, they could be sent to other landfills.
All right,
Yeah,
thanks,
so
Andrew.
Jim, if I could just, the thing I'll add to that real quick is, so when you think about the stuff that's leaving this facility, these different wastes come there in different forms, sludges and liquids and that sort of thing. Liquids can go through their wastewater treatment plant where they remove, different concentrations of metals, or, maybe adjust the pH before that liquid goes into the sewer system. And when the treated wastewater leaves their facility, it has to meet standards set by the Great Lakes Water Authority that are protective of going into that sewer system. So if a sewer worker were to come into contact with that liquid, it can't cause any sort of, toxic reaction at the wastewater treatment plant. It can't cause any toxic chemicals to pass through the wastewater treatment plant and go into the river. So that's the one way things leave. And then what Andrew was talking about with the landfilling, I think, many of you have seen the trucks leaving as well. So in those tanks, those pits Andrew was talking about, they mix these sludges and these wastes with what's sort of, like a cement dust. And so what's leaving is the contaminants are bound in this material. So you essentially have a truck of these gray, sort of sandy, granular, we call them treatment residuals, but it's, it's the finished product And then that material is safe for landfilling. It's dry, and the contaminants are sort of bound up chemically in this cement-like material, and that's unsafe for landfilling.
All right, thanks. We are going to go, I'm looking at my board here and we got a couple of people with their hands raised. We got kind of an interesting situation because we got like 11 people logged in under the name Carolyn Ledley and somebody named Carolyn Ledley has raised their hand. So if you have raised your hand and that's what you're logged in under, and usually that happens because somebody shared a link and so a lot of people are logging in under the same name. So if you raise your hand, your name is, if you logged in under Carolyn Ledley, I'm going to unmute your line and hopefully you'll see something pop up on your screen and you'll be able to unmute on your end and ask your question. So if you logged in under Carolyn and you raised your hand, you should be able to unmute your line and talk.
I may be one of those people. Do you
Yep.
hear me?
Yep, that's you. Go ahead.
Okay, hi, my name's Birch. I'm a neighbor to the facility. Among its many national facilities, US Ecology is a company that has not just violations, but several accidents and actually disasters involving major explosions, fires, and loss of life. Are these disaster records of the company even outside of the Detroit facilities considered in the review process? Thank you.
Thanks. Who wants to address that?
I can start, and then I will look to maybe Andrew or Al or Rich Conforti if they want to add anything to this. Certainly we're aware that US Ecology, we license all of their facilities here in Michigan. And one of the things we're doing here in Michigan is, as we review a license, we're trying to make them consistent across the facilities. And so what you may have heard from Andrew in the beginning is, well, this facility used to be EQ Detroit. Before that, it was US Liquids. And these different facilities were owned by different companies at one point, and they had different conditions and they did different things. But as they've all come under the US Ecology umbrella, and as we have sort of refined our licensing processes, one of the things I'm seeing that I'm really encouraged by is I'm seeing sort of greater consistency across all of these facilities. And so if we identify an issue at one site, we say, hey, is this an issue at any of your other sites in Michigan, right? So specifically with the waste acceptance plan, we worked really, really hard on the waste acceptance plan for the North facility. And this is the plan that, this is really sort of the crux of hazardous waste operations is, how are they screening what's coming into their facility so they know what they're getting? And so we took what we learned from that process and we're strengthening the waste acceptance plans at South and at Michigan Disposal, sort of across the board. So in that way, I will say we are considering what's happening at the other facilities when we consider a license. Andrew or Al, I'll let you add anything to that, since you guys are the licensing guys, you might want to add to that.
Hey, Tracy, this is Rich. I'll add on to that. You're absolutely right. Going consistency across all of them. So if we do see something even in another part of the country, as was brought up, we'll see if any of that would be applicable to our locations. Each treatment storage disposal facility is unique to itself, and they're run independently. And each license is independent too, for just those reasons, so that it might be similar operations and then we can be consistent across them, but we do take into consideration when we look at them as far as what's happening in the past. Again, if we've seen something that's occurred over in Arizona or Utah, and we would see if it would be applicable here. Is there a condition that might be one of our permits that needs to be modified? So yes, I would say we do take a look at that and put them in consideration.
All right, thanks guys. Going on again to our board here, hands up, looks like a Sharon B. Sharon, I've muted your line, and so you should be able to go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the information. It's very helpful. My question has to do with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And my question is, throughout the license renewal process, exactly how will MD Eagle evaluate and consider cumulative impacts from other nearby sources that may be exacerbating the adverse effects that are being disproportionately borne by communities of color, as required by Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Yeah, thank you, Reverend Buttry. I appreciate the question. It's nice to hear from you. Good evening. And so as I think, probably many people on the line are aware, but probably not everyone, we are going through, what's called a Title VI complaint regarding the US Ecology North facility. And this is an issue that group is working on. So I will look to Regina or Al, who are much more well-versed in those requirements, if they'd like to discuss and address Reverend Buttry's question.
So I'll start, and Al, if you want to, add anything when I'm done. I think the key with Title VI is the fact that it is about discrimination, and if actions are discriminatory, and that's part of the review process. As of right now, there is no direct link between the way we regulate and Title VI. And I know that's something we're reviewing now, looking at how that can be integrated in some way if it can, and that's part of a broader process. So in this particular situation, ultimately, this is going through the regulatory process as it stands now. Not to say that there may be, and there already have been really many changes related to Title VI that have been made, and including the hosting of this community meeting, because the goal there is to really provide access to make sure that communities are informed. For the last, I'd say, over the last year, I think there've been a lot of changes in terms of the amount of information, the amount of outreach, the ability for folks to provide input, because I think that's a really important part of taking into consideration potential discrimination and other actions that could disparately impact communities. And that's part of the overall view, that we're looking at right now in the process that Tracy referenced in terms of the complaint, as well as overall how we do our work from the EGLE perspective. And so it is right now, the way that Title VI plays out in our licensing for hazardous waste is still, kind of in process. And it's been challenging, I think, over the years to really fully implement the ways that the intent behind the creation of Title VI just overall have impacted the actual regulations. And so that your question is appreciated because of that broader perspective. But it's hard to say the direct impact, but there will be impact, I think, from whatever comes of that process more broadly in our hazardous waste licensing. And I don't know if I touched on everything that you would add, if there's anything you want to add, Al?
No, I think that's a good overview. Obviously, we want to use Title VI to improve our licensing process and the potential impact of these facilities on communities in which they're located. We're not, as Regina noted, we're not waiting until we have, complete resolution on the complaint to start implementing some of the things that we agree are important and that we can do now. A couple of examples of that are, the increased number of public meetings early and often, trying to understand better what the community's concerns are and how we can respond to those. As Andrew pointed out, we did have a significant interest of folks from around the US Ecology North facility. And because of that, even though technically I don't think we would have called this a limited English proficiency the community, we did do the translations, and we're trying to build in those types of outreach into our program. It's going to take it, the cumulative impact question, that's a difficult one. We have clearly authority over US Ecology North, but it gets a little more challenging when you're talking about other facilities that may be not regulated under the hazardous waste program. That is something we're looking at, and we should have some better answers to that question in the future. But I can't tell you specifically what that resolution is going to be. But it is a good question, and I think it's an important one because US Ecology is not existing out there all alone. There are other things that can impact the folks' health, and we should be taking a more comprehensive look at those.
Yeah, thanks, guys. There's another question came in the box related to Title VI while you guys are there. And this, I think you've been touching on this, Al, but this person's asking, can you include this in the renewal process so our community can better understand the impacts of this facility? So how would these disproportionate impacts or other cumulative things, are they addressed in the renewal process or in the permitting?
Right now, they are not directly addressed, but again, as we go through this process, we'll make every effort to bring them in if we can legally do so. And that it's not, this is a major issue. We haven't done a lot of cumulative impact work for single facilities. And I think the only other thing I would say is perhaps we could bring in our colleagues from Air Quality Division to talk a little bit more about cumulative impact, because this is something that they're struggling with too. This is not just a hazardous waste thing. This is a department thing, and it is important.
All right, thanks. We do have quite a few questions to get to, so I want to keep this moving along here as best we can here, because I want to get through as many questions as we can tonight. There's a question here that came up early on. Someone here asked, how can someone provide a written comment if they're unable to attend this meeting? I know this isn't an official hearing, but as we get into the process for commenting, how will they be allowed to do that, or how can they do that?
Yeah, so earlier I offered up Andrew Bertapelli as our one point of contact. I think that's easier than saying, if you want to know about this, call me, and if you want to know about that, call Regina. So let's establish Andrew Bertapelli as our primary contact. So his information's up on the screen. For those of you on the phone, I'm going to say his phone number one more time. I apologize, I just got a pop up on my screen and now I can't see his phone number.
It's 517-290-3813.
Thank you, Al. Every time somebody puts something helpful in the chat, half of my screen gets blocked, and so I can't read what's at the bottom there. But Andrew can be the one point of contact, and like Jim said, this isn't an official hearing, so this isn't your only opportunity to provide contact. We're coming to you tonight just with information to say we're starting this process. We're reviewing this application, and it is our intention to complete a technical review. Here's where you can find the information. Here's where you can review the materials. And we have a lot of opportunity for conversation between now and any potential decision. So use Andrew as a point of contact.
Yeah, thanks. And I got his name and number on the screen for those that are logged in. Here's something that Andrew brought up earlier about the buildings. If there's negative pressure in this building, how come there have been odor violations?
So I'd like John Lamb or Jeff Korniski to come on and talk about, those are the guys that do the vast majority of our odor investigations and the odor surveys at that facility. So they could explain best what they find during their surveys.
Yeah, so as far as the odors go, the building is under negative pressure where they do the ChemFix building that Andrew discussed earlier. Now that building is under negative pressure and it's controlled by a bag house. So all the emissions go through the bag house, but however, the bag house is there to control particulates, not odors. So in that exhaust, you do get odors out of that exhaust from the processing.
All right, thanks, John. Going to our people on the line here with their hands raised. I got someone named KT who's got a question. KT, I've unmuted your line, so you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank you for allowing us to share the link and the phone numbers to this meeting because that additional step sometimes deters residents from joining easily. So, my question for you today is that Eagle should use this renewal process to ensure that the facility does not just continue its 25-year history of emitting these overwhelming odors that continue to inundate our community and reducing our quality of life. I have to shut my windows and go inside and cancel barbecues because of these odors. And you acknowledge that this facility has a long history of odor issues dating back to 1995, and we have counted 21 odor violations that have been issued by Eagle since US Ecology took over the facility in 2014. And 2 of those, of October 15th and November 20th of 2020, were issued after Eagle and US Ecology entered into a consent order in September that was meant to address these orders. So obviously previous license renewals were unable to curb these violations. What can you do in this licensing renewal to make sure that these order violations are truly addressed? Thank you.
Thank you, KT. I appreciate that. So so like she mentioned in her question, we do have this consent order. The reality with addressing nuisance odors is that that consent order was not going to be a silver bullet, right? There was not a designated fix or a certain, one thing that they had to do that if they just did this one thing, the nuisance odors would go away. And so I'll be very honest with you that this is not going to be an immediate fix. But the consent order, I think of it as a process, right? So it requires this odor management plan that we received today that identifies things they can do in the short term. So when they are notified of an odor that's happening right now, what are the things they can do? So are there certain processes they can change, or are there engineering controls or other things that can be done right then? And then what are the things they can do sort of in the long term, right, to improve how they're screening the waste that's coming in, how they're conducting the treatment process, or, if those things are not enough, what sorts of physical engineering controls may be necessary to address this problem. But admittedly, that's going to be a process. The way I see this working into the license, though, is that if whatever comes of this odor management plan, and like I said, it has this a constant evaluation process built into it. So quarterly, US Ecology has to report to us and say, these are the things we're doing, what's effective and what's not, and we have the opportunity to have this sort of back and forth. But whatever comes of this can be built into the license as well. And so it's not just attached to this consent order, it can also, end up in license conditions. So one of the things you'll see in a hazardous waste license often is references to approved operating procedures, right? And so this may be something that ends up in an approved operating procedure. The consent order, is, like I said, it's one tool. The violation notices were a different, sort of less formal tool. I know that this community has, had an odor burden for a long time, and there's a lot of history there with the incinerator, and so I know that this is not a welcomed problem. It's not a new problem, and so I'm just honest with you, and I say it's not going to be a super quick fix, but we are committed to ensuring that this problem is resolved so that the folks that live there can live there alongside this facility and not suffer these nuisances.
All right, thanks, Tracy. We have a couple questions here about air quality and monitors, so I know John's probably still there. A couple questions on why aren't there more air monitors, and what do we monitor for? What pollutants do we monitor for?
I think if Amy Robinson's available, this is a question for her.
Yeah, sure. I can. I think Amy Robinson is in our audience here, and I'm gonna just look her up real quick here and bring her on if I can find her. Hold on a second, Amy. There she is. So Amy Robinson from Air Quality Division. I am, oops, wrong person.
No.
Yep, there you go, Amy, go ahead.
So they monitor for total suspended particulates and some metals, lead and chromium, that can affect your health. At our nearby site, which is over by off of East 7 Mile by Osborne High School, we have additional monitoring over there that the state does. And that is actually going to get expanded next year and monitor for a lot of VOCs and carbonyls that will help characterize the toxics in that area.
Thanks, Amy. How many air monitors do they have on site? John or Amy, do you know?
I think it's 3.
3? Okay.
Jim, can anyone from Air Quality Division answer that question of why is it 3?
It's, why is it 3 monitors?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that is, we try to get perimeter monitors around near where the emissions are coming from, so we can get multiple directions and be able to tell, we can combine that information from the monitor with wind information and triangulate either whether it's coming from off-site or if it's coming from on-site, which building it might be.
All right.
In addition to the air monitors, we also keep track of their emissions on a monthly and annual basis, and they're required to report their emissions to us on an annual basis for some of their pollutants. So we do additional tracking of their emissions beyond just the ambient monitors on site.
It's another question that came in on that too, is that have you seen any exceedances in the thresholds that you mentioned?
From the air monitors or from the emissions?
Well, they're asking, have you seen any exceedances of the threshold of the air thresholds? I'm assuming, whether it be through monitoring or I'm assuming it's from the monitors.
Can I just pause for a second, just so folks understand? And I'll attempt this because I'm the non-air quality person, so I'll try to put it in like the least technical terms, and the air folks can jump in when I inevitably get it wrong. But there's these 3 monitors at the facility, and those are intended to capture what's happening at US Ecology, right? And certainly they're open to influence of other things as well, construction or truck traffic or whatever else may happen in the area. But then Air Quality Division also has monitors around the metro area to just monitor, regular air quality, to sort of give us a baseline of what's happening with air quality. And that's not necessarily associated with any particular facility. So I think when you heard Amy talk about the facility over on, I think it was 7 Mile, I think that's what they call an ambient air monitor, right? That's just sort of telling us what's going on in the neighborhood. The 3 monitors at the facility are to monitor, what's coming from this facility. And then I think there was a question of, are those meeting criteria? And Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's on the scorecard we've put on our website, right? And there's some, there's a list of all the data that's been submitted, and what their sort of score is, for compliance. I think there's some recent data that's under review, but largely every other month was nothing above criteria other than this most recent submittal, right?
Yeah, Tracy.
Yeah,
What
go
was
ahead.
that, Rich?
Yeah, yep, you're right. That
Okay.
information is up on the scorecard, and it does show that the most recent stuff was, and total suspended particulate was the one. The metals and all the other ones have not been exceedances.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I know we had a lot of questions about air quality and air monitoring. That's why I wanted to make sure we addressed them. Trying to move on a little bit from the air monitors right now. I asked some other questions. If you do have more questions about air monitoring, would they reach out to John? Is that who they reach out, or Andrew, and he'll forward it on to John? Or
Let's just keep Andrew as a point of contact, and then, you know, depending on the nuance of the question, he'll get it to the right person.
All right, Andrew, put your name back up there. Okay, going back to my board of people with their hand raised. Looks like we got another person with the name Carolyn with their hand raised. So if you raise your hand and you are logged in under Carolyn, I'm muting your mic, so you should be able to talk. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yep, go ahead.
Hi, not Carolyn, Abraham Ayash, State Representative for House District 4, which houses US Ecology South. So I just want to first thank you guys at Eagle for doing this early on. So if you guys can lay out a couple points, but before you do that, if I may just speak to folks that are on the call. So you guys are you know, incredible for taking the time out today to listen in. And I would encourage folks to report every single time you're by that area and you smell anything or you see anything with regards to this, you know, any odors. And if there's any bothering components of, you know, trucks or traffic, or even like the visibility of some of these sort of pipes and whatnot, let's see if there's anything that you guys find problematic as a way to try to slow down and sort of eventually, you know, the hope long-term is we don't want to see any more of these facilities. But I just had a couple of questions for the folks at Eagle. Number one, what's the timeline for this process? If you can rehash that for us. And then the second point is, you know, is there a possibility where a permit like this doesn't get renewed? And then if not, I guess what could be the best case scenario for, you know, Detroit and Hamtramck? If you guys can just touch on that as far as possibilities, as folks start reporting and showing some of their frustrations in the process, whether it's the civil rights violations or just the actual emissions of odors.
Thank you for your comment. This is Al Taylor from the hazardous waste section. Yeah, you know, your first question, timeline, I would anticipate about 6 months before we're going to be able to complete the technical adequacy portion of the review. During that time, we can certainly continue to talk with folks. These are fairly large gatherings, but just because, you know, in other cases, we've had things called office hours, where we could meet more frequently with smaller groups to talk through some of the questions and concerns. And we'd be happy to do that. But for the next major meeting like this, possibly in person, if we get to that point where we can do that, would be approximately 6 months from now, when the technical adequacy review is complete. Then following that, you know, we would be making a decision as to whether to proceed with drafting a renewal operating license or a decision to deny the operating license. So yes, denial is always an option on something like this. That is just part of the process, and we will work through it. It is complicated in a good way, that we are trying to review the Title VI information and complaint, and you know, to the extent possible, we're going to incorporate that into this licensing decision and future licensing decisions. This, you know, these are intersecting together, but you know, it will take some time But this is a progressive path forward to get a better outcome for the community, a safer operating license, and we will continue that path.
Okay, thanks, Al. Thanks for your question, Representative. Going on to our next person with their hand up, B. Finch. B. Finch. I've unmuted your line. Go ahead.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. I am a member of the 4820711 Grassroots Detroiters, one of the community groups in that area. I did a lot of reaching out once we became aware of the this meeting tonight, and I was able to speak with quite a few members of our community and gather concerns. One of the major concerns was that we did not receive notice about this. Some people didn't receive any notice, but most people received notice yesterday. And also that Zoom is not a good, I understand we're in the pandemic and that the possibilities of us meeting in person are limited, but Zoom is not a good thing for our community because there's not a lot of people over there that even have access to Zoom. So actually I'm coming to you with the concerns and questions of quite a few people from our community, and I will try to keep them brief. One of them, of course, was the late notice. Also that we have lost a number of people in our community to cancer. The asthma rates are high. We get no compensation for being exposed to these hazardous chemicals and waste. We should be getting something in the way of if it's just a report of what are you exposing us to and what should we be looking out for. We get no tax breaks, no disposal fees. Let's see, they don't want the license to be renewed. I haven't spoken with anyone that wants it to actually be renewed. Also wanted to know how can we go about making sure that it is not renewed. There were some questions about the Eastern Market being right down St. Aubin and their project. How can you have a food hub right down the street from hazardous waste? That doesn't go together. Let's see, I'm sorry. And there are quite a few concerns with the air filtration system due to the fact that we are getting odors continuously and that so many people are getting sick. So that's just a few of the questions. I tried to keep them brief. I know that was a lot, but I tried to keep them brief, and I'd appreciate if whoever could address them.
Thank you. Tracy, did you get those? Or do you
I took some notes.
Okay, cool.
I will do my best. And Ms. Finch, we can have I'm happy to have a conversation after the fact, or if you want to reach out to Andrew, we can set up some time to go through more of this. I'll put a thumbtack on the issue of notice and like the platform that we're using here. I want to get to your sort of more technical and health related concerns. So the fact that this facility is here, we addressed in the beginning, and I know that the location here is a challenge, and we are coming to you as your state government saying, we have this process and for regulating this facility. And I know there's not a lot of satisfaction in my answer that this facility is here, and our process does not provide for it to be relocated. So I know that is not a satisfying answer. And like Regina mentioned, there's a lot of history that went into all these decision makings of how land was developed and housing policy and all of that. And we can't undo all of that with this licensing decision. The facility has an existing license that they are largely compliant with. There are dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of different requirements that they have to comply with every day. I don't say any of that to dismiss the nuisance odors. I know it's a very real issue, and that's why we took an escalated action on that, right? Because we are taking that issue seriously. So the siting is one issue that we cannot change in this licensing action. But I do want to make you aware of one other mechanism that applies to this facility that we haven't talked about tonight. That is something you can potentially, address directly with US Ecology or through your city government. There's a Wayne County ordinance that requires that any facility that manages solid waste have something called a host community agreement. And those of you who were alongside us during the US Ecology North license action became familiar with the host community agreement there, and some of the changes that were made to that to address community concerns. And so I would offer that as a potential avenue for addressing these very local community concerns, and encourage you to reach out to your city council representative. And that might be something that, or we can get you the right contacts at the city. That might be something that could be revisited to address some of these very localized concerns. I want to ask for some help on this question. Like I said, Andrew, if you could talk about who the notice went out to, and then Jim, if there was any other sort of big ticket parts of that question that I missed.
There's a couple questions about the air emissions related to the Eastern Market and emissions going over there and impacting food and the air filtration system, I think.
Yeah, so I think, I'll turn that over to maybe Jeff Korniski or John Lamb, but I do want to bring back one sort of point. And that is, what I recognize is the natural anxiety when we talk about a facility that manages hazardous waste, right? That we are bringing hazardous waste from around the metro area, across the state, and from out of state to this facility to store it, treat it, and move it on to its final destination. This facility is in the business of doing that responsibly, and that is a service that our industrialized society requires, right? And so I would say there's not we have to think about the perception of risk and the on the ground risk. And so in terms of food at Eastern Market, we have to think about what is the potential for exposure there. So we have this air monitoring system. There's, they're not permitted to discharge, their air permit addresses what can go out in their air emissions. And so there's not a recognition that there's a exposure there at Eastern Market. But I know that just the proximity is uncomfortable. So I guess if Jeff Korniski or John Lamb, if any of you want to maybe touch base more on the air monitoring and how that might impact Eastern Market, or anything else you might want to add to what I've said.
Yeah, I'll add that, when we issue an air permit, we do an analysis of all the processes on site and all the materials that they're processing. And we do modeling and screening for toxics and all that. So to make sure that what we allow them to do on site is not going to have a health impact off-site in the where the residents live. When we do that, we have restrictions on the types of materials they can process, the quantity and composition of those materials that they're even allowed to take in. Then on the back end, we have control systems. We have a bag house on the ChemFix building. We have a scrubber on the main building on the tanks to control for additional control on the materials that they do process. And we also have limits on their actual emissions on site that they're allowed to do on a monthly and annual basis. And I just did an inspection there in August, and they were well under their permitted limits for their emissions. So.
Thanks, John. Jim, could I follow up with just a couple things? And maybe this is something that Ms. Finch could put in the chat if that's a possibility, or I don't remember. She was on the phone, right? So maybe that's not the right way to ask for feedback. But, I am sensitive to this issue of access and how can we best reach people. The reality that we're in right now is we can't gather. I can't ask 5 of you, I can't ask 50 of you to join me in a physical room somewhere. And so, we certainly recognize the limitations of these virtual tools that we have. But I'll say, Jim Ostrowski and his group, they chose Zoom for this purpose over some of the other options because it does have this call-in option. I know it's a little awkward. You can't see the presentation. I know there's limitations on library access and all of that now, but if someone has seen this done better elsewhere, you guys have a lot of involvement in different community groups. If there's a tool or a technique or strategy people are using different than this, we're happy to do it. If that means a few different small groups meeting with people less formally, just over phone calls, we're happy to do that. But I'm open to any input on that issue.
Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
I have a question, a couple of comments. I understand you guys are looking at paperwork. You're looking at results of tests that you've done, but has anybody actually come into the community, talked to the community, did any studies in the community about how we are being adversely affected by this business that is reaping benefits in our community? They're making money over there, and we are suffering the consequences of them reaping benefits. We're not getting anything from it, and who's actually come out into the community to see how we feel and what we're going through? Because you're looking at papers, but we are actually living it. Even before the pandemic even came around, no one, I could be wrong, but I've never heard of anyone coming out to our community and addressing us and our concerns and how we would feel about this. What I'm really hearing from you guys is that we are stuck with it, and it's just gonna be there. There's nothing that we can do about it. Am I understanding that correctly?
All right, thanks for your question. Tracy, you want to take that, and we'll get through this question, and I have some more people that have got other questions too. Thanks.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you did hear that, in terms of citing this facility, right? This licensing action we're taking is not a decision on whether or not the facility should be there. And I know something we've talked about as a group and with some subset of you before is, often during these licensing reviews, one of the things we hear is, the community does not want this here. But I think what Andrew went through in the beginning is a good reminder that our evaluation under the law, as the law is written and given to us to administer, is that we have to evaluate this based on the technical requirements that apply to this facility. And so if the facility meets the technical requirements of the law, we are required to grant their license. And so there's not a built-in mechanism there for what I might think of as like a popular vote, right? So I hear that quite often, right? That we just don't want this place here. And I'm compassionate toward that, but we have to think about this in terms of the law that we're given to work with, right? So that's why, Andrew comes to you with this really technical discussion of tanks and secondary containment and monitoring and all that, because that's the framework we are given to evaluate these places.
So really quick though, can we just, a couple questions were like, have we been in the community before discussing this issue? And, the question about how people are notified about this meeting. I think those are two things that we haven't really addressed so far. So could you take
Andrew,
those?
can you talk about how the notice went out for this meeting and who got it and when?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had a couple different methods to notify people about the meeting. And I think it's a good point, and people actually are getting the notices as recently as yesterday. That's something we definitely want to look into. A couple of the notification methods that we used for this was a press release that went out, I believe it was last Tuesday or so, if I'm not mistaken. And my understanding was that the postcard mailers that we had translated into different languages would be to people by the end of last week. So if that isn't the case for people, that is a good point for you to bring up so that we can look at exactly where those delays are occurring. We also had this posted on the Eagle calendar, and we've also set up that web page with reminders about the meeting. So that point is well taken, and we will definitely look at that and what potential delays could be occurring here so that we can do that better next time.
And then in terms of being in the community, I think that, the most familiar face here is probably John Lamb. He and his colleagues are the ones that do all the odor surveys when we do get odor complaints. I know that they go to residents, they stand on the porch and, they try to experience what the resident is experiencing, when the complaint is occurring. But your point is well taken about, I think what we're getting at is is there a health study being done, right? I mean, who's looking at, the cumulative impact of this facility and, the incinerator that was there for decades and all of these things. And, I think someone touched on this early on that, our regulations don't provide for, in a very sophisticated way, or if at all, for the assessment of cumulative impact. The regulations and the science just aren't there yet. So, I'll offer that to Al or Jeff Korniski if you want to say anything more about that. I know that's a very real concern. It's a very real challenge, and I don't have a good answer for how we take into account health impact in those communities.
So I just wanted to jump in and just say, I'm going to share my email address. I know Andrew's address is out there more broadly. So we can talk more about, the community. So I'm strong r1@michigan.gov. And so, I know that we'll try to answer as much here, but I'd love to talk more about specifically some of the concerns that you're sharing on behalf of the community as well as yourself, and how we can make that connection. I know our outreach has been very challenging during the pandemic. And so we're trying to reach folks as much as we can. So if you would please email me, and then we can connect and touch base, and I can learn more about how we can help in terms of working with the community, to your point about where we are in the community and reaching out to the specific people in your community.
And
so Al, I don't know if you were about to add something.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions tonight, and that's a good thing. We're trying to reach out on multiple different platforms, by mail, by Gov Delivery, which is email, and with press releases and things like that. It is very difficult to reach everybody, and we do rely on some community communication for that as well. We're going to continue to keep improving that. I really would encourage you to sign up through the website for future information here. The other thing I'm going to say is, because we have so many questions, we're probably not going to be able to get to all of them tonight. What we're going to be doing is capturing all of these and developing kind of a question list, or I don't know if it's a frequently asked question, but if we get a question, we're going to capture it and put an answer out there, and that's going to be an evergreen document. Those answers may evolve as we go through this process and learn more about the operating license that we're reviewing. And but we're going to try to be as transparent as possible and make sure that you have the information that we have on this facility and how we're viewing the information. So.
Thanks, Al. I was just going to say that I'm doing a time check here. The meeting's supposed to go about 7:30, and I know we're past 7:30. We got so many questions that have come in. Like you said, we're not going to be able to get all of them, but I'm going to take a few more. And then what we'll do is I'll share all the questions that came in with the team so they can address them, like you said, Al, as appropriate. And I did put Regina, you said your email, I put that in the chat for people that are following the chat. So I'm going to go to a couple more questions that have come up. I'll let Kay Cumbo talk. Just unmuted your line. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Oh, good. So I didn't hear you mention radioactive waste, and there's concern about radioactive waste, both because of what they have stored there and what's coming in. They store fracking waste, I believe, and also they have waste from Lucky, the Lucky site in Ohio that has both beryllium, which is not radioactive, but also radioactive waste. However, something occurred this fall that you may not know about, and that is that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is now looking at a new category of radioactive waste called very low level waste, VLLW, and they're fast tracking this in interpretive rule so that it can be released without further tracking or monitoring into unlicensed municipal and hazardous waste landfills and other destinations once they are declared exempt facilities, with an intent but no guarantee that they'll bury these dangerous wastes. And they didn't mention in the Federal Register notice, but 2 years ago when they did the scoping study for very low level waste, they said that the reason they needed this new category was to identify possible options to improve and strengthen the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's regulatory framework for the disposal of the anticipated large volumes of very low level waste associated with the decommissioning of nuclear power plants and material sites, as well as waste that might be generated by alternative waste streams and that may be created by operating reprocessing facilities or a radiological event. And they also mentioned, they also had a question that they asked the public, and that was about how the public felt about transboundary waste. That's waste that comes across the border. And they didn't limit it to Canada. They said transboundary waste. Once you open that up, you're opening it up to all countries or all approved countries. And there's no clear or legal definition of this very low level waste. It's an interpretive rule. And the reason they did an interpretive rule is so that they would not have to do an environmental assessment. And so there's the one definition they gave was allowing 25 millirems per year. But the problem with that is that millirems, you cannot measure millirems. That's not a measurable, it's not a physical measurement, and it can be manipulated. And that's actually more than is allowed currently at the 4 low-level, so-called low-level radioactive waste dumps in the U.S.
Hey, ma'am.
So, yeah.
I'm going to stop there. I'm sorry, but I'm going to let our team here talk a little about radioactive waste because I want to make sure we get a couple more questions here. But
Okay, sure.
so I think I get what your question is, and can a couple people on our team talk about the concerns that we've got here related to radioactive waste?
Yeah, I'm going to give that to Al, if Al can.
Thanks.
Can address
Okay,
that.
and I'm gonna ask the permit engineer or Rich, because I'm not very familiar with that aspect of the site. And I think, as Andrew mentioned earlier, if we don't have an answer, we'll get it for you as part of this. But Andrew or Rich, do you have information on that?
Yeah, this facility does not take radioactive waste. The only thing they may have taken was what we call TNORM, which was it is a technically enhanced naturally occurring radioactive material. Fracking waste, as it's referred to, because that's regulated under the solid waste rules. It's not regulated under the Part 111 hazardous waste rules. So it could be handled at this location. I don't know if there's anything there now, but it could be there. But as far as radioactive waste, no, they're not allowed to take that here.
Yeah. So just to get to her question too, the type of waste she's talking about, the very low, is that anything that would be covered under this too?
Again, if it's not a hazardous waste, then it's not regulated under the hazardous waste permit.
Okay.
Yeah, one clarification I'd like to make is this is not a disposal facility like a landfill or something like that. It is a treatment facility, and material that's treated there is then sent offsite for disposal, or if it's the liquid waste can be aqueous and can be discharged after treatment to the Great Lakes Water Authority system, then that would occur. But there's no disposal at this point.
All right. Thanks, Al, for clarifying that. And Rich, I'm going to go to one more hand raised. Again, this person's logged in under Carolyn. So if your hand raised and you're logged under Carolyn, I just unmuted your mic. Go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, hello. I thank you for taking my call. I just I just know I go down Ferry all the time, and I can see, I was on a tour of the facility, and the facility manager showed me where the most hazardous waste is stored, which is on the north side of a wall on Ferry Street that is in barrels and is about 40 feet from Ferry Street and is visible beyond the chain link fence. And the only thing that's really a barrier between an errant bullet or an out of control vehicle is a chain link fence. And I wonder if, is that up to Eagle standards? Is that something you've thought about? Potential for accidents.
Yeah, thank you for that question, sir. Andrew, can you take that question?
Sure. It sounds like you're probably talking about that transfer processing area. So the hazardous waste that I'm working on wouldn't actually include that portion because that's regulated separately as a transfer site under the transportation rules.
So that's the transfer and processing area?
Right.
Okay. So, and that is a question I'll get more information and I can circle back with you on. And Jim, if you have contact information here. So I do know that area is limited to 10-day storage. So that's material that's coming in and is not destined to be treated at US Ecology Detroit South, but is going into a to another facility. But I reminded that, yeah, we have multiple people logged in under that, under Carolyn's name. So if you can, maybe stick around at the end of the call, we can get some direct contact information. I'm happy to take some notes on people that need follow-up. But one thing I would add is to what Andrew was talking about, the entire site, you know, has to have different secondary containment requirements. And so in the event that there were some sort of you know, off-site impact there, an accident or a bullet or something like that. You know, there's you know, on-site surveillance and security and containment, you know, in the event of any of that. But I can certainly look into whether or not there are specific engineering standards that apply to that area, and then how that fencing works into it.
All right, thanks. And let me try to unmute the other Carolyn here that's logged in, see if that works. Go ahead.
Hey, I just wanted to quickly flag this for folks. So you know, hearing some of the concerns about what we can get out of this and how we can protect ourselves in the long term. You know, Eagle, unfortunately, are restricted by what they have to do by the law. That does not mean we don't push them, right, as much as we can. But I just wanted to use this opportunity to say, if folks want to get in touch with me, and I can be sort of the conduit to try to give you guys as much information as I can as far as what we can do legislatively and where we can push Eagle and get more information on getting something out of this agreement through the Wayne County host agreement. You know, please stay in touch with my office. You know, my email is abrahamiash@house.mi.gov. If someone from Eagle side can share that, I would greatly appreciate it. As always, you know, we are going to be doing some work over the next couple months, surveying the community, trying to find a way to streamline a lot of the reporting that we have to do. Anytime we have concerns of a smell or an odor, or if we see something that's not okay, we are going to work with folks in the community to try to make sure that we are as efficient and as effective as possible with reporting all that information. So other than that, you know, please stay in touch. My cell phone number is 313-770-1780. And again, the email is abrahamiash@house.mi.gov. Abraham spelled like Lincoln, and then Ayash, Ayyash. If someone from Eagle can write that, that'd be awesome. So there's no dot. It's just one word, abrahamiash@house.mi.gov. And then my cell is 313-770-1780. Thank you guys for the opportunity to just clear that up, because I know folks are frustrated, and you know, our job as legislators is to try to push and fight as much as we can to make sure that Eagle is going to do as much as they legally can to look out the interests of our communities, and less so for these corporate stakeholders that simply just want to use our communities as dumping grounds. I can tell you, I'm not convinced that anyone on the team at Eagle, you know, is satisfied with what they can do as far as restricting what they can, but there's a lot of those technical limitations that we can try to fight legally. But in the meantime, we want to try to change some of those laws as well in the long term. So, there's going to be multiple fronts that we can fight this over the next year or so. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Representative. And Regina did put your email in the chat. I think she added that period there and now she took it off. So the second one's the right one, right, Regina? Okay, so that's in the chat. Thank you for commenting on that.
Anyway, so yeah, you know what?
Okay, thank you. All right, so we're nearing 8 o'clock, and I know we've got a ton of questions that have come in. Our team can see them. We're not able to get to all of them. So Tracy and Al, Andrew, I'm going to be forwarding those on to you, and you can deal with them as appropriate. You do have the Andrew's email up on the screen right now. I'm going to let Al and Tracy, do you want to kind of wrap us up a little bit? Because we are quite a bit over. I want to be cognizant of everybody's time tonight. That's on the line.
I appreciate that, Jim. And I just really appreciate everyone taking the time to join us tonight. I know we have left a lot of questions unanswered. I think we could have probably scheduled 4 hours and still left some questions unanswered. But I guess what I want to remind folks of is this is the beginning of the conversation. So one of the things I saw, I was scrolling through the questions and reading, trying to get a sense of what was being left undiscussed. And, one of the questions I saw was, why are you just coming to us if you've had this application since 2007, 2008, I think it was. Al mentioned this. Unfortunately, due to resource constraints, this application has not been under review since that time. And so, the priority to get this application reviewed and this license re-reviewed is a high priority for us now, and along with our prioritization of community engagement, right? So I think those two things together mean that we'll be talking to you more often. So please don't think we've been reviewing this for 12 years and we're just now coming to you. But unfortunately, this is part of a backlog that we're working through, but we're coming to you now, and we are really hoping to have this, more regular and earlier conversation when we take these sorts of actions. So this is just the beginning. I've offered Andrew up as our one point of contact, but you all know you can contact me directly as well. The representative has, offered his information. There's lots of folks you can reach out to. So, I encourage you, to reach out if you want to discuss any of these things. Al and I will look at this, and we will find a productive way to sort of summarize and maybe get some additional information out on that website that we built. I might need some reminding, but I think it's michigan.gov. I don't know, Jim, can you bring up what the website is specifically for the website so I don't get it wrong to the folks on the phone? But, we'll use the input we got from you all tonight and the kinds of questions that we got and the kinds of questions we weren't able to answer to improve these resources here and get some maybe work on a frequently asked questions document or something. So that website is michigan.gov/US Ecology Detroit South. So again, that's where the application is, that's where the scorecard is, the action summary, the translated documents, but we will continue to build that as a good resource. So go back there, and the contact information is there as well for Andrew, for our local inspector, Jim Day, for anyone, you may need to reach for questions on this. But again, just thank you for taking the time out of your evening and listening to what we have to say and having this conversation with us. But Al, do you have anything you want to say before we wrap up?
Only that I want to emphasize the thank you for taking time out of your day to do this. We recognize these are difficult conversations. You're not enjoying this any more than we are, but we're here for a reason, and that's to get a better outcome for this. So we will commit to doing that. We will work on getting these questions summarized and up on our website. And we agree that the Zoom is not the best way to do something like this. If there is a better way, we'll try to find it. But I'm hopeful that the next meeting that we have will be in person. And because I think that's a more effective way to communicate on these things. Again, thank you for your time tonight.
Yeah, and I do hope to see all of you in person at some point
Yes.
this year. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Regina, did you have anything to add to? Just making sure.
I'll just echo the thank you to everyone who hung in, listened to us, try to answer your questions. I appreciate that. Many of you still may have questions, and as I've shared my email, please feel free to reach out if I can be of help.
All right, thanks. Thanks to our entire Eagle team that was here today to help us out. And thank you, all of you who joined us tonight. We had over 60 people logged in to listen in, and still many of you are still on. So thank you, everyone. Like I said, we did record this meeting. We'll be posting it up to our YouTube channel. You'll be able to find it on the Detroit South website we've established, so you can share it with others who might have missed it or might have come in late or couldn't be here for the whole time. So thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have a great rest of your evening.